of those affected. But the common element is to commit some violence on the nature of those affected. The 7 rings that Sauron gave to the dwarves merely produced a deformation of an appetite the dwarves already had, greed for riches, and he considers them a failed experiment. The 9 rings Sauron gave to men yielded them military and political success, but bound their spirits to the world, right? The spirits of men are supposed to leave the world. The 3 rings of the elves were produced out of their own knowledge without Sauron's involvement. But as Elrond tells us, they were for understanding, making, and healing, to preserve all things unstained. Well, let's modulate that into another key. The purpose of the Elving rings was to fix some features of the current state of the world in place and make them permanent. So Rivendell's been going, Elrond's been living in Rivendell for thousands of years. Lorien's been around since the end of the First Age. But things in Middle-earth are supposed to change and decay and renew. Another Aristotelian moral conception is essentialism about functions. That is, given the nature of a creature, there will be a single correct account of its end and proper functions. A rational creature differs from a non-rational creature in its capacity to form a reason for acting independent of those functions and ends. In particular, reason makes it possible to separate functions from ends. Now, modern moral philosophy sees nothing troublesome in separating functions from ends because it denies the essentialism of functions and ends to individuals or to creatures of certain kinds. For modern moral philosophy, the individual's reason for performing the function determines the end. Now, rational agents can use their capacity to separate functions from ends to go wrong with respect to action. They may take the function itself as the reason and ignore the end. Such a misplacement explains why most of us find wine connoisseurship and bodybuilding corrupt preoccupations. The functions of drinking wine and exercising have been detached from their proper ends and their proper place in life and taken as ends in themselves. They have become forms of vice. However, the most frequent way to go wrong in action is to concentrate on the end and ignore questions of function. But then, is it the same end that is achieved? Or is achieving the end without the function an illusion? For Aristotle, if we could build an ultimate machine which satisfied all our needs for us, cured us, built us houses, made us shoes, leaving us to be passive recipients of pleasure, he would not consider this the coolest machine ever, right? He would consider such a machine a source of corruption. The end of human beings is not passive pleasure. We would not be desiring the right ends, no matter how similar to those ends they seem. Or a more concrete example, the Britannia Professor Di Silvestro. A few years ago, we had a visiting lecturer from a university in Thessaloniki, in Greece. And we were going out to dinner after, much of us went out to dinner with the visiting professor. And we started talking about families, and as you know, Professor Di Silvestro has a largish family. This professor happened to mention that, if you were in Greece, the government would take care of their health and education and pay their child care expenses, basically maintain their children. And I could tell what Russell was thinking. It occurred to me later on. Russell wouldn't view that as being given something. Russell would view that as having something taken away from him. In the end, the ultimate responsibility for his own family. He would just now be a sort of pretend dad. The real dad would society itself. Modern moral philosophers, however, I think lack the vocabulary for criticizing the machine. They're like Mary Midgley's Martians. Understanding that goals are the point in hockey, the Martian takes 20 pucks down to the end of the ice and fires them into the cage from a cannon. It's not going to be easy to explain to the Martian or to ourselves just what's wrong with this. The end may only be specifiable through the functions, playing hockey, that are performed to achieve it. To fail to apply the concepts of function and end to actions, making do with the modern conception of behavior, is to obliterate morally important differences. Thus armed, we can understand why a ring of power would be so corrupting, and what particular distortions of the appetite it would produce. A ring of power would function as a moral shortcut. It would serve as a means to achieve what appears to be a given end without the bother of mastering the functions leading to that end. It would bestow power that does not flow from the capacities, knowledge, and mastery of the user. It is not necessary to impute conscious intentions to the ring, as Peter Jackson's film version does, I think to some dramatic effect, in order to understand that it is embodiment of knowledge and power, and that this knowledge and power has been separated in an unnatural way. While performing functions we have mastered is pleasurable, that mastery itself is the most difficult and arduous part of human development. It is the ultimate confirmation of Philippa Foot's profound comment. She's one of those people who can be profound in a passing comment on the difference between human and animal life. Unlike human beings, she says, animals do not have suffering as part of their normal life. If an animal is suffering, it's because they've been injured or there is some improper function, something has gone wrong. But anyone who has raised children or been one, or been subjected to piano lessons at the age of 6, knows what suffering is, right? And they know that in order to make children, in order to turn children into human beings, as opposed to little feral beasts, it's going to require a great deal of self-restraint. It's going to require a great deal of imposition on them. All of us suffer. Achieving the end of human development without suffering is the continual temptation facing us rational agents throughout our lives. To succumb to the temptation is to corrupt our appetites. The clearest example, again, is addiction, where you get what feels like the pleasure that comes from accomplishment, feeling like king of the world, but without the effort of actually mastering anything. And then comes the cold gray dawn. This is what makes addiction so corrupting. Thus it is with the rings. They constitute a standing temptation to step outside the limits of our nature to achieve an end. We can see why it would make no difference whether the end the character sought through a ring was good or evil. Even an end that looked superficially like a good end, if achieved through a ring, would not be that end. It would be something else. In Lord of the Rings, the good characters have certain advantages. They have the self-mastery that comes with temptations overcome, suffering transcended. The corrupt characters have their advantages too. They can bully and lie. But Tolkien is also very clear on their disadvantages. If corruption is a loss of goodness, then it must be a loss of certain capacities, certain powers as well. The good characters have this continuing advantage, according to Tolkien. They know how evil characters are motivated and how they will act. They know this because, of course, they've been tempted too. The evil characters, in their corruption, lose their capacity to understand the uncorrupted and why the uncorrupted do what they do. This is the decisive fact that determines the outcome of Lord of the Rings. Not that that outcome is determined, obviously, it's providential at the end. Sauron's corruption is so complete that for all his knowledge, he cannot imagine that any individual coming to possess the ring would choose to destroy it instead. All the clues, therefore, that he receives regarding the fellowship, and notice how careful Tolkien is to let us know at every point in the story what Sauron knows. Intelligence so extensive that it even includes Frodo's clothing. Dwarf coat, elf cloak, blade of the downfallen west. It's in the end not enough. He's still fatally surprised. Bilbo frequently uses the ring as a shortcut. The ring confers invisibility, though we discover that this invisibility is more apparent and real. And much like Gyges in Plato's Republic, Bilbo uses his newfound ring to steal stuff. Although the victims of Bilbo's thefts are Gollum and Smaug, the dragon, robbing robbers has always been a morally dubious shortcut to the restoration of justice. Again, Boromir serves as an example. His goal is to save Gondor from the Dark Lord, but he conceives of this end as saving Gondor from Sauron. Taking the ring from Frodo by force would achieve this. But Gondor would still be ruled by a Dark Lord. It would just be Boromir himself. Once he considers taking shortcuts to achieve a worthy end, the corruption of his appetite is already advanced. There is no stable stopping point, no easy way back. When Boromir is given the grace to save himself, he accepts it before his corruption is complete. Saruman and Gollum do not. Frodo's own resistance to the ring's constant temptation, though it means when his resistance is broken in the end, and remember, Frodo fails in the quest. Frodo finds himself then in the position of a recovered alcoholic friend I knew once, who told me that not a day passes when he does not think about drinking. And this hated desire is a torment to him. It limits his capacity for happiness. So Tolkien refers to Frodo's journey into the West. This is in a letter from Tolkien's collected letters. He refers to Frodo's journey to the West as purgatorial, but not penal. He's going to be cured of his desire for the ring. He's going to be healed of this. So to understand Tolkien, it is necessary to enter into this pre-modern way of moral thinking. But what if this issue extends beyond literary criticism? What if pre-modern moral philosophy gets the moral realm right? Then The Lord of the Rings is about what modern novels from Dostoevsky's to Le Carre's are also about, the moral realm we really live in. Like Boromir, Denethor, Saruman, Feanor, we must consider what our actions are really for. Any activity will have its proper end, and shortcuts will defeat that end, and good intentions can be the worst trap of all. 2 final points. A magic ring is a common MacGuffin in literature. If you'll invite me back, I'll talk about Tolkien and Wagner. Nevertheless, it is possible to wonder whether the history of Gollum is Tolkien's response to Glaucon in Plato's Republic. Glaucon, as you will recall, recounts a Persian fable as a challenge to Socrates to produce a defensive justice that even the possessor of a magic ring would accept. Here's somebody, who's beyond the reach of justice. He's untouchable. Nobody can punish him. Nobody can bring him to account. What would you do with it? Well, obviously, kill the king, marry the queen, subject all of my fellow citizens to my reign of terror in order to satisfy my desires. What would persuade someone who possessed a magic ring to accept the limitations of justice? Tolkien's answer? Gollum was shunned when he was visible. Even though you may have complete power over others, they can still make you pretty miserable. They can still withhold what you truly desire, pleasure in their company. Tolkien's Christian Aristotelian beliefs remind him of what Glaucon forgets, that we, men, elves, hobbits, and dwarves, are social creatures. A lonely tyrant is still lonely, and loneliness is the worst punishment we can inflict. The rings constitute a shortcut in this fashion, too. They produce ends that look quite like the ends achieved through society, but without the trouble and bother of social cooperation. This is the truth of Bilbo's wealth. It is true of the political and military success of the Nine, the ring race. It's true of the maintenance of Lorien and Rivendell. Alone in his dark tower, Sauron's solitude is total. He has no fellowship, only slaves, enemies. One of the more acute lines from Peter Jackson's version of The Fellowship of the Ring, which I think is one of the smartest scripts ever written. Galadriel's statement to Frodo, to bear a ring of power is to be alone. Galadriel doesn't say, and perhaps she's forgotten over the ages, that this lonely possession of power is unnatural to both their kinds. One surprising fact about the current world situation is that among the most underdeveloped societies in the world are certain oil exporting nations. By all the indices of development, literacy levels, productivity, treatment of women and minorities, absence of corruption, presence of responsible government, strength of civil society, technological production, literary and cultural creation, they're close to the bottom. But they're not poor. We would think that social development is a function which has as its end making the society rich. Yet those societies are rich. Being rich, it would seem, is an imitation of the end. Oil extraction has not facilitated the development of these societies and their achievement of their proper end, but hindered it. For these societies, oil has been a ring of power.